Your great-grandmother never drove to a feed store. Not once. And her hens outproduced most backyard flocks you'll find today. That's not an accident. That's a system, and it's one that most chicken keepers have completely forgotten. Here's the reality. The average backyard flock costs somewhere between $20 and $50 a month just in commercial feed. Multiply that over a year, and you're looking at $600 in feed costs. For eggs, you could get a different way. Depression-era farm families didn't have $600. They didn't have $6. And their flocks didn't suffer for it. They used 3 systems. And those 3 systems, running together, are what kept their chickens fed, healthy, and laying through some of the hardest years this country has ever seen. We're going to cover all 3 today. I'll be honest, the third one is the one that changed things for me. But you need the first 2 to make it work. So, let's start at the beginning. System 1 is fermented feed. And before you scroll past that, I know you've heard it. But I'd be willing to bet you haven't heard why it worked the way it did for the old-timers, and that changes everything. Here's the science in plain English. When you soak grain in water for 24 to 48 hours, naturally occurring bacteria get to work. They start breaking down the feed before it ever hits your hen's digestive system. The result is a feed that's more bioavailable, meaning your birds absorb more nutrition from every single pound. Same grain, more nutrients. That's the whole game. The 1930s method was dead simple. Every night, before bed, farm families would take the next day's grain, wheat, oats, corn, whatever they had, and cover it with water in a crock or a bucket. They'd put a cloth over the top, tie it off with twine, and leave it on the counter overnight. By morning, it was alive. Literally alive, teeming with lactic acid bacteria that their hens could actually use. No supplement, no additive, just time and water. Now here's the part most guides leave out. There's a starter liquid. After your first batch, you don't dump the liquid at the bottom of the crock. That liquid is alive. You save about a cup of it and pour it into your next batch. Think of it like a sourdough starter. It carries the culture forward, and each batch gets stronger. The old-timers knew this instinctively. We call it the inoculate now. They just called it common sense. One warning before you move on. There is one mistake that ruins the whole batch, and it's the simplest part of the process. Don't use chlorinated tap water straight from the faucet. Chlorine kills the bacteria you're trying to cultivate. Either let the water sit uncovered overnight to off-gas, or use well water if you have it. That's it. That's the one thing. Everything else is forgiving. Your hens will eat less of fermented feed than dry feed, typically 20 to 30% less by volume, and they'll absorb more from it. The old-timers weren't rationing. They were just feeding smarter. But fermentation only stretches what you're already buying. The Depression-era farmers who really cut their costs weren't just fermenting purchased grain. They were growing it. That's system 2. Let's talk about the 3 plants that Depression-era farmers grew specifically to feed their flocks, and why most chicken keepers today don't even consider them. First, sunflowers. Not as decoration. Not for the seeds on your salad. Sunflower heads were grown in volume specifically as a winter protein source for chickens. A single large sunflower head contains hundreds of oil-rich seeds, fat, and protein in one package, harvested in late summer and stored dry through the winter. Flocks would work through them in the coop during the cold months when foraging was impossible. Second, amaranth. This is the one most people haven't heard of, and it's the one I wish someone had discovered sooner. Amaranth is an ancient grain that grows fast, tolerates drought, and produces thousands of tiny protein-rich seeds on a single plant. Many homesteaders soaked, sprouted, or fermented the seeds before feeding them, while others simply allowed chickens to harvest them directly from mature plants. Either way, it provided a valuable supplemental feed source that could be grown right alongside the garden. The old-timers understood something we've largely forgotten. Some of a flock's nutrition can come from crops you grow yourself. Third, pumpkin and squash. Specifically the seeds. Pumpkin seeds have been used as a natural dewormer in folk animal husbandry for generations. There's a compound in the seeds called cucurbitacin that's hard on intestinal parasites. If you're already growing pumpkins or winter squash for your family, the chickens get the leftovers. Seeds, flesh, rind, they'll take it all. It costs you nothing extra. 3 plants. All of them low maintenance. All of them heritage varieties. All of them dual purpose. That's all System 2 requires. You don't need an acre of pasture. You need a fence row and some intention. Systems 1 and 2 cut your feed bill. But System 3 is the reason the old-timers never worried about feed costs at all, even in January, even in a bad year. In 1932, nothing left that farmhouse kitchen without a second purpose. Potato peels, stale bread, vegetable trimmings, apple cores, spent grain from home brewing, all of it went into a tin pail by the back door. At chore time, that pail went to the flock. Every single day. That's not a romantic detail. That's a calculated waste elimination system. The chicken was the farm's recycler. Every calorie diverted to the flock was a calorie not purchased at the feed store. Modern households throw away somewhere between 30 and 40% of the food they buy. Most of that is chicken appropriate. You're already paying for it. Now here's the piece that most people miss. The old-timers didn't just feed scraps randomly. They followed a seasonal rotation with their scratch grain that stretched a 50-pound bag 2 to 3 times further than modern feeding ratios would suggest. In the warm months, scratch grain was a supplement, a small afternoon scatter to encourage foraging behavior. The flock was expected to work. Kitchen scraps, insects, green forage, that was the primary diet. Scratch grain was the reward, not the foundation. In winter, when the ground was frozen and foraging was gone, the ratio flipped. Scratch grain went up, but the fermented feed was doing the heavy lifting nutritionally. The caloric load from scratch was about warmth. Birds burn more in cold weather. The fermented feed was about production. The third piece of the rotation was the garden itself. In late fall, after the last harvest, Depression-era farm families would open the garden gate. The flock would spend the next 6 to 8 weeks working those beds, eating pest larvae, scratching in weed seeds, fertilizing as they went. By spring, the beds were cleaner and richer than they'd been in the fall. The chickens did the work that would otherwise take hours with a trowel. That's the system in full. Fermentation stretches what you buy. Supplemental crops replace what you'd have to buy. And the rotation eliminates the waste that leaves money on the table every single day. When all 3 of these are running together, something shifts. Let me tell you what that actually looks like. After years of raising different breeds and plenty of trial and error, I can tell you what a flock looks like when it's on the system. The feed bill drops. Fermentation alone typically cuts feed volume by 20 to 30%. Add scraps, add supplemental forage, and you're looking at a purchased feed cost that's a fraction of what your neighbors are paying. Egg production holds steady or improves. Not because of any supplement or additive, but because the birds are getting more digestible nutrition from what they're eating. Gut health improves. Feathering improves. The flock is calmer because they're not competing for inadequate nutrition. You can see it. It's not magic. It's just what chickens were designed to eat. Varied, fermented, foraged. Before the commercial feed industry convinced us that a bag of pellets was the whole answer. If you want to start with just the fermentation piece, the quickest way to get System 1 running this week, I've already put together a short 3-minute breakdown on the channel. It covers the exact process, the starter liquid, and the one mistake to avoid. Link is in the description below. Depression-era farmers weren't cutting corners. They were closing loops. Every scrap had a destination. Every season had a strategy. Every bird was expected to earn its keep, and the system around it was designed to make that possible without a monthly trip to the feed store. That's the part we've lost. Not the knowledge. That's still there if you know where to look. What we've lost is the habit of thinking that way. And habits are recoverable. Start with System 1 this week. 1 crock, 1 night, water, and grain. That's all it takes to begin. Which of these 3 systems are you already running or planning to try first? Drop it in the comments. I read them all and love learning from this community. And stay close. Next video, I'm covering the one ingredient the old-timers added directly to their fermented grain that nobody talks about anymore. It's not what you think. I'll see you then.